Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here, and I'm here today with another discussion video. I'll try to make it a discussion video and not a complete rant. Obviously I'm a bit late to the game on Picard. I didn't do a whole follow-along series with it because I was just like, I didn't want to judge it until it was complete. That being said, nowadays there's one thing I am going to judge, and in fact I remember my aunt asked me, why have they got an elf in Picard? And I was like, that's a very good question. Why is there an elf in Star Trek? Obviously, Elnor. Why? Why is he a thing? And why does he just have a sword? And why is he literally just a space elf? So that's really kind of what I'm going to address. And, well, more generally, address the issue of using a melee weapon and using swords and such in sci-fi. Should you do it? Is it really practical? How should it be done if you're going to do it? So we'll keep it within franchise for the time being and talk about the Klingon Batleth. Now, Batleth, I'll actually want to talk about other Klingon weapons as well. I'll do a detailed... I'm thinking I might actually do a detailed breakdown of the Batleth because there's a lot to talk about. I know other people have already done that, but I want to get my perspective. Essentially, it's a very good weapon for blocking slashing attacks, someone coming at you with a saber or scimitar, someone who's going to be doing a lot of swinging and slashing. It's not very good against stabbing attacks, and that's mostly what you're going to be dealing with in the close quarters of a starship. The other problem with the Batleth is it requires two hands to wield, and really you could make better use of the other hand with a disruptor pistol. So Batleth isn't really the great choice for, close quarters fighting in a starship. That being said, other Klingon weapons are very good. I really like the Mek'leth. Worf's weapon, you see him using it in First Contact. It actually reminds me a lot of the Kukri. And anything that reminds me of the Kukri is in good ground. It's small, compact, handy. You can still carry a firearm in the other hand. You can still carry a disruptor pistol. So that's kind of, you're getting the best of both worlds. Again, same thing with the Duck Tug, which is more of a stabbing weapon, but you've still got that ability. You can shoot and stab. So you've got best of both worlds. And the Klingons make good use of this in boarding action. So within that and within the universe of Star Trek, it does make some sense. Would it maybe be more practical for the Klingons to use a bayonet? Possibly. That's what the Jem'Hadar use. The reason the Klingons use what they use is kind of cultural. And maybe, yes, a bayonet like the Jem'Hadar have would be more practical. But it's not terrible. And yeah, if you do it with a two-handed wielding, you're pretty well geared up for fighting in a starship. Now, using that then out on the field, on a planet, maybe less effective. So now I'm going to move on and talk about the use of other melee weapons in other science fiction. I'm going to talk about Halo specifically because there's a good understanding there there's a good depth there to not only the weapons, but also their tactics. So we'll start with the Elite Energy Sword, which we encounter from the first game and is always in it. So with the Energy Sword, it's, as a sci-fi weapon, is very, very good. It can cut through anything. It's a one-hit kill. If you're going to have a melee weapon in a sci-fi setting where you've got power armor and all this stuff at play, absolutely have something like this. It's not utterly dominant, and sword elites, while scary, are not the most dangerous thing on the battlefield. Anyone who's played Halo will know this. In Halo 1, so I'm now going to really cover the tactics that they seem to use. So in Halo 1, I think we do encounter invisible sword elites and regular sword elites, gold sword elites. And they basically, I think, as far as I can recall, gold sword elites definitely just rush you. They just straight up rush your position, and they won't ever stop. So if you can gun them down, you can get them. So they're not that they're scary, but they're not necessarily dangerous. I don't recall if the invisible sword elites do the same or if they're a bit more clever. But moving on then to Halo 2 and Halo Reach particularly, and then 4, but particularly in Halo 2 and Halo Reach, sword elites are smart. They're really smart. And they use good tactics. So a sword elite will not just straight up charge you the moment it sees you. It will keep its distance. It will often be supported by other units. If it's an invisible sword elite, it's going to still wait for an opportunity. It's still not going to just straight up rush you. It's going to wait till you're in an exposed position, and you're perhaps preoccupied with another enemy. It's going to wait until it thinks it can close that gap, and then it's going to get you. And actually, the same thing with elite ultras with swords or elite zealots with swords, whatever. They all have that same approach, is that they are going to wait until you are you're in an exposed position, you are vulnerable, you are in range, and they know they can get you. The rest of the time, they're actually going to hold back, they're going to keep their distance, and they're going to lob grenades at you, trying to disrupt your positioning, make you vulnerable. And that's when they go. Even though they do have a lot of health and shields, they'll still be very cautious about engaging in melee because you can be mown down. It's worth pointing out that Halo is a very arcadey sci-fi. Weapons in there don't have as good a range as they would have in modern day. So real life, sword elite probably wouldn't be nearly as capable as they are portrayed in the video games. The point I'm making is that there's tactics. They don't just straight up rush you, and they're not hacking their way through ranks and ranks of enemies. They have to be careful and consider how they approach things, and they're not nearly as dangerous as a elite with a fuel rod cannon, or elite with a concussion rifle or a plasma launcher, or a plasma cannon. These are all much more dangerous. Those are all much more dangerous and difficult to deal with than a sword elite, because a sword elite can't attack you unless you're in range. Those things have a much further range, so they're attacking you much more frequently. Although there is a little bit more leeway, but not much. There's not much room for error with stuff like fuel rod elites or even plasma cannon elites. They'll kill you pretty quickly. So is the sword elite the best? Probably not, objectively speaking. It is probably due to, again, those cultural practices that the Covenant make use of them. But it's reasonable enough, and if well supported, they can be dangerous. But they are much more there as... if you wanted to be a dangerous elite, there are much better ways of going about it. There's also the gravity hammer. It's much better for sort of crowd control. If you imagine the fact that the brutes are meant to be these enforcers for the prophets, it makes sense that they have this weapon that can, keep push back whole crowds. It's not a man-to-man weapon. It's dealing with mobs. Very good, very effective. Again, great sci-fi weapon. There is a slight difference in terms of wielding. They're much, your hammer brute is much like other high-ranking brutes, but he does, when he attacks with the hammer, he goes berserk and he will not stop attacking with the hammer. So once he's committed to the charge, he will continue to charge and will not stop. And in that way, he's not necessarily as smart as the sword elite. The weapon is also much slower and clumsier and much more easy to evade than the elite sword, although it compensates for that with its area of effect. They do have other weapons or other means of engaging the player, obviously throwing grenades. They also have invincibility, which is great, and it can maybe give them the opportunity, but you can run away from that and you can play with that. And it's the fact that the hammer brute, once he charges, he's committed to it. That's their greatest flaw, I think. Now, that might not be other people's experiences. They maybe have engaged hammer brutes that have been perfectly smart and have disengaged from a charge. But in my experience, when they charge, they're committed to it. Hell or high water, and if they die, they die. what we have in Halo is you have melee weapons. They are present. They are reasonably capable and definitely a threat. But they require a certain level of tactics, and they also have to be, themselves pretty high-tech bits of weaponry. They're not just coming at you with a plain old sword. There has to be a lot of thought and tactics behind their implementation, and they're not great in all scenarios. Like I say, a brute chieftain or an elite with a fuel rod cannon or plasma cannon is much more dangerous to the player and much more difficult to deal with, in my experience. So this really then just leaves us with Star Wars, and suffice it to say, Star Wars' melee weapons are excellent. The lightsaber is great. It's undisputably a very good sci-fi blade weapon. But it is very heavily requisite on being used by a Jedi. I think if you really wanted to, you could have something more in line with like a Gungan shield or other kind of energy shield, or just plain shields. We see plain gun shields work. Vibroblades would be another option, and probably just as comparable. We do see other things like Beskar and other armors can kind of slightly repel, not necessarily completely deflect, but dampen the effects of a lightsaber. So using armor and using shields and other things can be effective against a lightsaber. It's not completely dominant, and as time's gone on, we've seen more counters to them. But the lightsaber remains very capable, and it's the only one that can actually deflect blasters back at the opponent, which is excellent. As some people have suggested, actually, Jedi would do much better if they used blasters or other weapons as well as their lightsaber, because it still does limit their range a lot. See, with other things like the Mandalorians and other very capable fighters, that you can be a very skilled fighter and you can kill a Force wielder. With just good, accurate blaster fire, you can kill your Jedi pretty easily. That's how Order 66 happened. So again, even in Star Wars, there's which is the most fantastical of them all, there's a concession, and even Han Solo's like, lightsabers are dumb. I'm going to use a blaster. It's way better. So there is actually that acknowledgement that lightsabers, they're good, they're pretty good, and if you have the skill to wield them, it's like your French knights against English longbowmen. It's like, are the knights very well trained, very well armoured with their swords and armour and horses and everything? Yes, but they can be defeated by some English boy with a longbow. And there's a lot more of them, and okay, yes, longbows take a lot of training, but it's pretty cheap training. It's just do it every day. They don't require expensive armor and equipment. They don't have to feed the horse and practice riding on a horse. It's overall a more economical soldier, and is just as effective, and in fact probably generally more effective than a knight on a horse. And that's really what it comes down to with that in Star Wars. And I think most sci-fi gets it right. So, can Elnor have a sword? Yeah, he can have a bladed weapon. Why is it just a plain sword? And why isn't it something more interesting? Why doesn't he have... that's the thing that really annoys me, is he's a sword. And it's no. It's the bat'leth. Okay... it's fantastical. It's not entirely 100% practical, but it's imaginative. And you look at all these other things. You look at the Covenant Energy Sword and the Brute Gravity Hammer. These are some imaginative science fiction weapons. And, there's concessions. They're not exactly the best, but they're, useful when properly deployed. But apparently just some boy with a regular sword and no particular tactics is just great and beats people with disruptors, and it's how? So it's can Elnor have a sword? Yes, but why would you do it? Why can't you be more That's really my main grievance, is if you used a little bit more imagination and creativity with Elnor, and not make him just a straight up space elf, you could have, he would actually be relatively convincing, although I still hate his Australian accent. You can have some, great skilled melee weapon wielding guy in science fiction, but be creative about it. Don't just stick a knight on the battlefield. Have some imagination to it. So I think that's really my rant, and I'm covering, really looking at how melee weapons aren't great in sci-fi. They add them, but at least when creators of science fiction add melee weapons, there's the concession to reality, which is that they're not practical, which is the frustrating thing about Picard, is that there's no concession to that reality, and that's what's really annoying. So that's my rant. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.